Well, hello there. Today we're going to look at the Danish philosopher and theologian Soren Kierkegaard. Probably the best way to describe Kierkegaard is as a Christian philosopher. He's been called the father of existentialism, and we'll see why that is with his definition of faith, his definition of action. Kierkegaard lives just after the time of Friedrich Schleiermacher. He is a contemporary with Charles Hodge. The two are living at the same time. Kierkegaard in Denmark, Charles Hodge in the United States. While Charles Hodge was studying in Berlin, Kierkegaard also was studying in Berlin. It's not clear that the two would have ever met each other, but they were in Berlin during the same time, listening to some of the same speakers. Now, we've seen that Schleiermacher is trying to overcome the problems developed by Immanuel Kant. And so his theology is a mediating theology, intending to bring theology up to date with modern understanding. And he's trying to show that human subjectivity does not relegate religion to the realm of morality. And so he develops a system in which religion is a feeling of dependence. Charles Hodge, we've seen, is largely working against Schleiermacher and those other mediating theologians who are trying to bring theology up to date with Enlightenment principles. Hodge is worried about rationalism and he's just worried about expressivism. And there, in expressivism, he's bothered by Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, Kierkegaard takes aim at one individual in particular, and that is George Friedrich Hegel. Kierkegaard disdains Hegel and Hegel's philosophy, and probably more the way that Hegel's philosophy was understood in Denmark is Kierkegaard's problem. But overall, Kierkegaard thinks that Hegel has reduced Christian theology to nothingness if his philosophy is placed on it. And so Kierkegaard is going to develop a strong argument and polemic against George Friedrich Hegel. The bigger project for Kierkegaard, and this reflects his place in Denmark at the time, was to renew Christian passion in his country. During Kierkegaard's lifetime, church attendance went down from about 70% down to 5% on a regular basis in Copenhagen, where Kierkegaard lived. He sees society becoming secular, even though it was officially a Christian nation. And Kierkegaard is very worried about this. He thinks that Christianity is dying, and the reason is that Enlightenment thought has overcome it. People are focused on reason rather than on passion and on faith. And so Kierkegaard's existential efforts are to focus back on what is a human being, how does a human being exist and choose and develop before God, and to understand Christianity in that light. Kierkegaard sees as a great problem the philosophy of George Friedrich Hegel. Now, Kierkegaard says at one point early in his career, Hegel would have been the greatest thinker who ever lived, if only he had regarded his system as a thought experiment. Instead, he took himself seriously to have reached the truth, and so rendered himself comical. Now that's about the greatest insult that any philosopher could give to another one. Their system was thought to be actually true, and therefore they're comical for it. Let's go back and understand the thought of Hegel so that we can better understand what Kierkegaard is reacting against. For Hegel, history, all history, works as a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's development over the course of time as one group becomes opposed to another, and then there's reconciliation or synthesis at a higher level. Something is learned in history, society gets better, and then that process repeats and repeats and repeats. And for Hegel, God, in fact, is learning through his other, that is, creation. And so the broader picture for Hegel is that God is coming to his own self-understanding through creation, and that's the development of history. And so the Spirit works in history to reconcile God with creation. This happens at a specific moment in the incarnation as God and his other become one. This then ushers in a new age of the Spirit and the church and modern society in which things are getting better and moving forward. That's the process of history as Hegel understands it. For Hegel, this is a story of steady progress in history. It's an inevitable progress. Human beings have to move forward. God has to be reconciled with his other. This development is in process and it will inevitably happen. And remember, for Hegel, Christian faith is somewhat incomplete in itself. It needs to be taken over by philosophical concepts in order to really be rendered pure thought. As it is, the mystery of it, the cultish ritual aspects of it, the things that people do that aren't really rational in it, all of these Hegel sees as still holding us back from what could be. Philosophy needs to take this over. And so, ultimately, what Hegel wants to invite Christianity to do is to give him the ability to redefine some of those symbols, and in so doing, then, he'll make the Christian religion pure. For Hegel, individuals don't seem to matter all that much. To get a sense of what Hegel is doing here, let's think of the Battle of Waterloo. This is the battle going on at the bottom of your screen. And think of watching that battle from a distance. You see great armies moving from side to side. You see one army advancing, another retreating, back and forth. And what's seen is great movements of armies, not really individuals. For Hegel, that's the way history works. It's an inevitable process that simply is moving forward. For Kierkegaard, this is complete and utter nonsense. For Kierkegaard, that eliminates the very thing that Christianity is based in, and that is the individual and the individual's faith before God. So what God wants, Kierkegaard thinks, is not some self-movement in history in which God is united to his other in creation in some inevitable cosmic process. For Kierkegaard, what God wants is for the individual to have passionate faith commitment toward God. So then, faith is at the center of Christianity. And the individual must be at the center of Christianity because only an individual can have faith. Also in this for Kierkegaard is the reality that faith must go beyond reason. For Hegel, remember, the idea was to shrink Christianity down as Kierkegaard sees it. Hegel wants to turn religion, Christian religion, into a series of philosophical ideas. And Kierkegaard thinks that will be the end of Christian religion because ultimately the realities expressed in Christian religion go so far beyond what can be grasped in intellectual thought that it would be ridiculous to do what Hegel is proposing. Now let's leave Hegel aside for just a moment, and since we looked at Charles Hodge in our last class, let's compare Hodge's understanding of faith to Kierkegaard's understanding of faith so that we can get a sense of the difference between these two. And it's a big difference. For Charles Hodge, faith is not a blind, irrational assent to something. It's an intelligent reception of the truth on adequate grounds. Now that's pretty key. What are those adequate grounds? Hodge is very optimistic that our reason can show us the reasonableness of faith. Faith is a very intellectual thing for Hodge because revelation is always cognitive. So for Charles Hodge then, faith is an intellectual act. Faith begins in the mind. For Kierkegaard, we could say that faith begins in the will. So for Kierkegaard, faith is an individual subjective passion. It's a movement of the will which causes me to choose something. That's where it starts. It may become rational afterwards, but it's at first an individual subjective passion. And so one makes a faith commitment to something that one simply can't access by reason until that faith commitment is made. Now, Kierkegaard builds a whole system on this. Faith is, for Kierkegaard, the most important task to be achieved by a human being, because only on the basis of faith does an individual become a true self. That is, Kierkegaard thinks that every human life is built on choices that we make in faith. All of the important decisions that we make in life, after all, happen with a degree of faith. Who to marry, where to go to school, what job to take, what career to pursue. All of these are decisions that cannot be made with perfect clarity about the future. We simply choose based on what we know right now, and we choose based on the desires that we have. Faith in God must be the most passionate of those decisions. And it's that passion, that decision, and the resolution to keep making that passionate decision that builds us into ultimately who we are. What we love defines who we are. So we become a true self as we have faith. Now, Kierkegaard thinks we always have faith in something, and that will make us the kind of self that we are. So the self is the life work which God judges for eternity. And what we become is the choices of faith that we've made over the course of our lives. For Hodge, all truth is God's truth, and truth can't contradict truth. And so for Hodge, faith must ultimately be rational. We must have reasons for it. It must be a very rational kind of thing. That opens the question, well, rational on what basis? Kierkegaard is very concerned about this. Anytime we say, well, Christianity is rational because, the because is going to be problematic. After all, it's because my human experience tells me so, because a philosopher says it's reasonable, because scientific evidence for now seems to back it up. Kierkegaard is suspicious anytime we say we have faith because of something that is grounded in the mind. Kierkegaard thinks we have to take a leap in faith, especially when it's religious faith. We have to take a leap, and that leap can be confirmed afterwards, but it has to be taken before it can be lived and understood. So, well, for Charles Hodge, revelation is a set of intellectual propositions. For Kierkegaard, then, Christian dogma embodies paradoxes which are offensive to reason. The central paradox is the assertion that the eternal, infinite, transcendent God simultaneously became incarnated as a temporal, finite human being. There are two possible attitudes that we can adopt toward this assertion, Kierkegaard says. We can either have faith, we can embrace that, or we can take offense. If we choose faith, we have to suspend our reason in order to believe in something higher than reason. So we must, Kierkegaard says in a famous line, believe by virtue of the absurd. To understand this better, let's take the biblical example of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. Is it possible to do that in a reasonable way, to respond to God's call reasonably? Kierkegaard writes a book about this. It's called Fear and Trembling, one of Kierkegaard's more popular books, and where Kierkegaard is emphasizing that faith can never be simply a reasonable activity. And he gives two reasons why. First of all, we're finite human beings. We could never fully understand God. If we can understand revelation, then it isn't revealed by God. It isn't God that's being revealed. Secondly, and maybe more importantly for Kierkegaard, we're sinners. We've offended God. We want to go our own way, so we simply don't want to accept certain truths about the world. We're inclined to deny them rather than to accept them. And as a result of that, our reason isn't working properly. So we would expect then that revelation would be a kind of truth that we would want to reject instead of accept. Now let's compare that with Charles Hodge. Hodge would have a very hard time, it seems, with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Because Hodge has said it's impossible that God should do, approve, or command what is morally wrong. Could God then ask Abraham to kill his son Isaac? That sacred human life that Abraham knows is sacred human life? On what basis should one accept God's command as a command or reject it? For Hodge, it would seem clear. It's clear that it's morally wrong. There's no way we can justify that act. Kierkegaard's full polemic in this book is against Hegel, because Hegel has said that Christian faith finally needs to be resolved into philosophical categories. And Kierkegaard says if this story has any meaning at all, and it is in the Bible after all, it can't possibly be reduced to Hegel's philosophical categories. There's no way that Hegel could philosophically resolve this problem in a satisfactory way. God's call to Abraham is absolute. Human morality is relative. We argue about it all the time, what is right and what is wrong. When God makes a command, we're immediately obligated to give our full assent, not to think through it and find out the reasonableness of it. And so Kierkegaard takes full aim at Hegel. He says Hegel's system cannot work if Christianity is to be Christianity, if that story in the Bible is to have any meaning. Perhaps we could change the image, and this would help us to understand where each of these thinkers is on the matter of faith and reason. Let's start with Charles Hodge in the middle. For Charles Hodge, very optimistic that reason can get at revelation, we could say that Hodge would look at an iceberg, of which there's so much more under the water than above the water, and he would emphasize the reasonableness of this part. He says there are some things in faith that you can see, and that is very reasonable. Faith claims fall into the line of reasonableness. We can check them out and have some empirical data given about them, and therefore they should be studied in about the same way that scientific data is seen. For Kierkegaard, the emphasis is on a very different part. That is, everything here below the water, and Kierkegaard's emphasis is that there is no possible way that the things that we see in our world can lead us to know anything substantial about what's under the water. To see the iceberg from above the water is to not know really much of anything about what's going on in the iceberg under the water. And so he would emphasize that, well, there may be reasons to choose Christianity rather than some other religion, reasons to be a Christian rather than not a Christian. Ultimately, it's a leap of faith in which we are giving ourselves over to something that we really don't know very much about and could never really prove in any substantial way. For Hegel, we could say that philosophy drains the water. It shows the iceberg in all of its exact glory, just the way it is when the water of religion is drained off it. The water of religion was necessary to float it up to this point to where we can see it, but now that we're able to see it, let's get rid of all of the mystery and strangeness and rites and practices of religion, and let's just look at the thing as a set of intellectual concepts. Kierkegaard is emphatic that that would end Christianity because mystery is the essence of Christianity. God is far beyond what can be grasped intellectually. And so if Hegel were to describe something in philosophical categories, it wouldn't be anymore revelation. Kierkegaard could probably get along with Charles Hodge. They just would understand that they were emphasizing different things, and Kierkegaard would always be very suspicious of Hodge, that Hodge's doctrinal system looks a little too clear in the face of mystery.